Hello, everybody.
Oh, hello.
Today I'm going to be doing a different kind of video than what I've done before, but I'm running these tournaments on Limitless. If you don't know about them, check out the Discord. I'll put the link in the description, but I've been running these tournaments now for a few sets on Limitless, and I wanted to actually start using the metagame data off of Limitless to do some sort of initial analysis, right? It's not going to be as big as a regional, but in terms of, smaller, 50 plus person events, usually, there's not a lot of good metagame analysis out there. And the really big tournaments, it's hard to get deep into it because you don't really see all the deck lists, etc. So, that's what this video is. I'm going to do a quick meta analysis of this tournament, my thoughts on, what it means for the starter deck meta in particular, like BT6 starter deck. So I know the folks in Europe have had this for a minute now, so maybe no surprises here. But for the North American audience, this was the very first tournament of any, maybe the first tournament at all with starter decks legal, was the one that I did last night. So this was a tournament I did last night. Security Control Kingdom is what I titled it. In terms of the number of people who actually participated, there was 48 players that actually submitted their deck lists on time, all that good stuff. And if you're wondering how I have all this data, for those of you who haven't played in either my tournament or some of the other tournaments that have been run on Limitless, Limitless is an awesome platform. Those familiar with Pokemon will know it. You input your deck via text export from digimoncard.dev, and what we're able to do is then see every deck after the tournament, and they get labeled, for the most part correctly. Connor and myself will kind of go back and forth sometimes about how to label different things, but for the most part, it's all captured here, and you can see win percentages, metagames, all that stuff. Really, really useful information here. So, obviously, some surprises already that you're seeing here in terms of the winner, but I'm going to go over to the metagame here and just talk about what this 48-person event, obviously bigger than your locals but smaller than a regional though, might be telling you about where the meta is headed. So obviously Jasmine, a deck that is very popular, was popular in my last tournament as well, continues to be popular, had a slightly better win percentage tonight overall, right? Obviously it didn't win the tournament, but it did well in the entire event. And then you have blue Gababond Bond of Friendship here at sort of 8 decks. So 25%, 1 out of 4 decks were Jasmine, and then 16% were Gababond. And I guess the other one of note here would be 3 Musketeers at about 10 to 11% of the meta share. Obviously, this brings me to my first point, which is if you're thinking of what is the tier 1 decks of this meta right now, both in terms of power and how much you're likely to see them played, I think without a doubt there are 2 decks that sit atop that, and that would be Jasmine and Gababond, right? Both of these had plus 50% win percentages on the night. Both of these decks had more than 15% share of the tournament. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but for those of you wondering how might the starter deck cards impact a little bit of the meta, I think it is largely more of the same, but these 2 decks do get more tools at their disposal to maybe help push them over some of the things that maybe people were worried about, which was set control, right? So there are actually 2 different categories for security control here. So that puts them at 6, slightly above 3 Musketeers. So you might want to say security control would also be in that tier 1 status, but I would argue that for this tournament, it still was not quite there. Didn't perform well at all tonight. But those are the 2 tier 1 decks. So what I'm going to do then is just take you through 2 decks in that category of Jasmine and Gababond in particular that I think did well in the tournament. Sort of discuss, my thoughts on them and how the starter decks maybe impacted them. So we'll start with Jasmine. This is the deck list for, I can't even remember. This is the second place players deck list for Jasmine. I can go look it up real quick. Let's see here. Standings. This will be Yurimura's deck list for Jasmine here. And, you know, if you're familiar with Jasmine, pretty standard stuff. The couple things that I'll point out here is the addition of the Geo Greymon here. So this is the starter deck Geo Greymon that has the security effect of coming into play and then deleting a Digimon with 4,000 DP or less at the end of battle, or just on play. So obviously this is, you know, some extra board presence. It's a level 4, which is nice. It has the ability to potentially delete something. Obviously you don't usually want to be playing this from hand, but that is something that is being run as a 3 of in this deck. And so that might be a change that you start to see, is more of those. And then I think the other thing up for grabs here, there's a couple of cards. This version of the list ran the War Growlmon, the when attacking, delete one of your opponent's Digimon with 3,000 or less. Also a starter deck card. It has the inheritable, when an opponent's Digimon is deleted, it gains Sec +1. I think this is a very interesting card for Jasmine because it is essentially, I think a lot of people were playing what the Volcanodramon or whatever. I can never remember the exact name of it, but it's the semi-vanilla level 5 that came from, I want to say BT5, that gave Sec +1 as inheritable. But the nice thing about this is in, you know, Jasmine, where you're playing a Digimon that's going to gain piercing when you play a Sistermon when it swings, and you can play Judgment of the Blade to swing over unsuspended things, this will essentially give it Sec +1 on that swing over something, in addition to maybe a Sec +1 Greymon underneath it. So it, I think, fills a nice void. And then as a level 5, being able to delete a rookie, essentially, also kind of powerful here situationally. So I know there's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not it should be only Savior Huckmon as your Digimon of choice, because the restanding is really, really powerful. But I think personally, having only 4 level 5s is very risky in any meta, honestly, because you have a very narrow stack at the top end there. And now one red Jasmine deck that did only have 4 level 5s was Izzy's, and he did go 4-1 as well and get 3rd place. So I think partially it's going to be a playstyle call there as to like what your preferred version is. I would lean in larger tournaments into having more level 5s because, yes, like if you're just going to luck sack your way through a whole tournament and win, fine. Like you can do that. But there will be situations where you're like, I could have won if I only had X. And like, you know, that's worth it to me. So your War Growl here, I think, is an addition you'll start seeing in a lot of Jasmine lists that want to be more consistent. Outside of that, the only other things that get added here is obviously the red memory boost as a 2. Sometimes you might see 3 of, but depending on space, 2 of here. And then he added in 1 Gallantmon here. It may have simply been to have another level 6 for Omnimon. It is a Sec +1. This is the starter deck Gallantmon that gives Sec +1 naturally. It also has a when attacking, a 4,000 DP Digi deletion. That's lovely. That's fine. You know, you can combo that with some Bao Huckmon stuff, maybe. I don't know. I think this is definitely a flex spot. Maybe you would even consider the other Gallantmon, but at 4 memory Evo, that's a bit harder to justify. Or even the War Grey, depending on if you're seeing a lot of security control. I think personally the Gallantmon here is a flex spot. I don't think it's necessary. Just my opinion. But two Judgment of the Blade, 2 Delicate Plans still for that set control matchup. Yeah. I think that's really what you're going to see here is... oh, also, I missed this one. The starter deck Gyumon. I don't know how I missed this. Yeah, if your opponent has a level 6 or higher Digimon, can Digivolve into a Gallantmon for a memory cost of 4. So obviously that might be why they play these Gyumons. It also has the inheritable when an opponent's Digimon is deleted, draw 1. Really nice in Jasmine that can have some consistency issues. So I would look at this more for the inheritable effect over the your turn Digivolve into Gallant, especially if you're like, I really don't need the Gallantmons. The only thing that you'd be missing here is the +1K Agumon, right? It seems like that's what was swapped out. But if you have the Sistermon CLs and you're gaining DP here, you may honestly, and if you're running the Baby Domon, that gets you +2K with piercing, you may not need the extra 1K. That just simply may not be necessary. So that is a flavor choice, I think. But yeah, that is Jasmine. And then we'll quickly look at a Gababond, which I think changed a little less. So Gababond here, it obviously gets the starter deck Gabumon. All turns, while you have 8 or more cards, you get +1 KDP. Really important in certain matchups. Maybe you need 15K to swing over something a little bit bigger. Or survive in the Gababond mirror. If you're 15K swinging in and you hit a 14K Gababond, that's really important. You also see the Cordramon, so the companion to the Geogray we saw in Jasmine. You have this Cordramon coming out of security and drawing you 2 cards on play. So more bodies on the field, which is exactly what Gababond wants. I think what I did see all night, if you're running a pure blue version of Gababond especially, it seems like what you're going to see is a heavy hybrid package. Only 3 Lobo and 1 Kendo in this one. I think some people might be playing slightly more Kendos or Lobos, but and then you're also seeing 2 Octomons here. That 7K can be huge, but yeah, the interesting thing here for me is I don't actually love Strabimon personally. Maybe if you're running the pure blue version, the Strabimon works, but when watching a lot of the matches last night, the Strabimon whiffed quite often. So that's kind of the one question for me is maybe you swap this out with the Gabumon that looks at the top 5 to add a tamer to hand. Because I would rather look at 5 and more likely get a tamer than look at 3 and try to get the plus of a tamer and a hybrid, because the odds that you hit one of the 4 hybrids that you run in your deck are a little low. But you know, just my 2 cents there. It may also be that they don't have access to the promo Gabu, which, you know, fair enough. But there was a few times too when somebody had to Evo into the Strabi in Raising, because that was the only rookie they had, which is a big feels bad. Because you're playing here 5 rookies that aren't Gabumon, so that's 5 targets that cannot go into Bond of Friendship in a deck that really going into Bond of Friendship is probably what you want to do more often than not. In terms of what else the starter deck may have changed here, I think you see people like toying with how much do I need Hammer Sparks and Memory Boost versus Howling Memory Boost. I think this will come down to a bit of flavor and how consistent you think your deck is. I think decks that want high consistency will swing more towards 3+ of this blue Memory Boost over here, just for the ability to look at the top 4 and add a Digimon to your hand over the Howling, which the Howling does not have any of that draw. It does stun one of your opponent's Digimon, which can be helpful depending on what turn it is, how much memory you have, etc. So, and then Hammer Spark is another one where I'm like, if you're running between Davis's, Matt's, and the Memory Boost, I actually don't know how much you need the Howling, the Hammer Sparks, other than really the security effects. But also opting 2 Kakaitis, 3 Rattlestar. All of the options here, I think, are things that are going to shift quite a bit as the meta progresses. And it just depends on the version that you maybe like to play. But I think Gababond and Jasmine, obviously the top tier of the meta here. So I'll get now into what I think was the biggest surprise of the night. The biggest surprise of the night to me was the winning deck. So Siba played a black deck, and this is the winning deck. The cards that are hidden here, you have, I'll scroll it down for a second. You have the Geogray and Mechanoris there that were kind of hidden by my face. But black is in a really interesting spot. This is for me, like the big surprise winner. Black did well overall in the night, and then obviously it won the tournament. I think it beat it beat a Gababond, I think, in the final to take the win there. And there were some really interesting situations that just sort of were like, oh, dang, in that Gababond matchup, there are some big problems for Gababond if this deck keeps to develop as it is. So what you can see here is it is semi-blocker heavy, right? You got 3 Shademons, 2 Mechanorimons. You have, you're playing the blocker inheritable Megadramon as well. And you have Craniumons at 3 of. So you can, if you get the right stack, you get the plus 2k opponent's turn. This is also a big one, the Gigadramon here, plus 2k opponent's turn. So the benefit of that is that you can make this Craniumon 14, and if you have one of the tie out, 15,000. And that 15,000 is really important because, you know, if you're a 15,000 Craniumon that can't be deleted, except with a Wyvern's Breath, essentially, it's going to be really hard for a Gababond to swing over that, because Gababond is most likely in a blue-only version going to stick at 15k max. You might, I think there might be a way to get to 16k, but that's tough. Yeah, you're looking at 15k, so if you have a Craniumon with a Gigadramon underneath it, then yeah, and a tie out, you're fine. You're sitting pretty. You're 15k. They're not going to swing, which means that your other blockers are also probably safer. They're going to have to trade their Gababond, which means they're trashing 2 security to trade a Craniumon with you. That's a feels good. So there was a lot of situations where between Craniumon and Mechanoriumon being the other big thing. If you have a Crania at 15k and a Mechanori at 7k on the field, then really there's very little that the opposing player can do to stop that. They have to rely on their Octomons maybe to trade with Mechanori, because Gababond doesn't really have a lot of options in between 7 and 15k. So they're sat there with like a bunch of rookies, roughly, that can't swing because of Mechanori, a Craniumon they can't swing over to start clearing the Mechanoris. And ultimately, like between that situation and Ultimate Flare, that seems to have been what pushed Black over Gababond. So that's probably why Black is in a really good position so long as Gababond stays at the top of the meta. Jasmine, let's look at who they played against. So he did beat 2 Jasmines on his way to that 5-0 finish. So 3 Jasmines. Oh my God. Yeah, so beating 3 Jasmines here, and Izzy and Yuri also getting 2nd and 3rd respectively. So the first place player went through 2nd and 3rd place in order to get there. So obviously it has a good Jasmine matchup, or at least he was able to do well against Jasmine, well enough. Maybe the Ultimate Flares or the Chikirimons here, which de-digivolve out of security, came in clutch. Hard to say. I know Jasmine does have the potential in the right stack to get up and over that Craniumon, like Judgment of the Blade, you swing over it, etc. Another thing that I thought was really interesting here in Black, which I haven't seen a lot of, is the Black Metal Garurumon. This is the promo from BT5. That basically has Reboot, and it gives you 2 effects. When you Digivolve, you can Digiverse to either delete one of your opponent's Digimon with a play cost of 6 or less, so a lot of blockers, or you can trash the top card of your security stack and gain some pressure there. So this is a really interesting combo here of Crania, Metal Gar. Alphamon is fine. You can sort of get large enough to swing over things. Alteress and Defeat, though, also being really big here in de-digivolving, deleting. Yeah, that is really big in the Jasmine matchup. So it seems that it answers 2 of the top decks. And between Craniumon also getting to 15k, you're forcing Set Control to find and use their Wyvern's Breaths on it. Very possible, granted, very possible. But if you get both ties out and Craniumon is sitting at 16k, there's actually nothing that what could it do? Maybe an Ultimate Flare. Yeah, you might be able to Ultimate Flare it, but that's kind of a tall order to ask of Set Control, I think. So yeah, this was my big surprise for the night, was Black. So expect to see a bit more Black moving forward, and obviously, how does the meta respond to that? In terms of the biggest surprise for me, obviously the biggest surprise for me was the poor performance of Security Control. Only 6 out of the 48 players played Security Control, so that's definitely a point to be made. That said, if I look at, where is the Security Control list? There it is. This was the top performing Security Control list. I think Security Control is not really taking advantage yet of the starter deck cards, to be honest. It may be that there's Cordramons. Interesting list here with the Gyumon going into Gallant, so for the late game, trashing a bunch of things. But otherwise, I think this is I think Security Control definitely is in a bit of an identity crisis in terms of like what route is the right route to go in any given tournament, because there's a lot of ways that you can play it, right? Do you play black base, red base, yellow base? What cards make the most sense? If Craniumon is going to become a bigger problem, Do you even start seeing more blue security control with Rattle Stars and Cocytus Breaths? I don't know. But Craniumon being a bigger and bigger part of the format definitely poses problems for security control, as well as the discovery of sort of that Agumon expert loop that we're seeing in some decks today, where you can expert swing, grab another expert, and you just kind of loop that to beat security control in a war of attrition. So that's the biggest surprise for me, is still a small sample size, but, you know, not really faring too well on the evening. In terms of the deck that I would say is a big downtrend, Three Musketeers, there was one 4-1. Red Scrocco did do very well with that. I believe he got 4th, if I want to say correctly. So this is that Three Musketeers list. You know, 3 Vilemons is pretty interesting. 3 Gazis. I think Gazi is going to be huge. So if you're playing 3 Musketeers, I think you need to play 3 or maybe 4 Gazimons just to be able to counter all of the memory gain that a lot of decks are going to get with those memory boosts. But overall, like, you know, I think a really skilled player can certainly pilot this well, but I think things need to go in your favor a little bit, and other decks are just very fast. So if you get a Jasmine or a Gababond that's a little too fast for a 3 Musketeers deck, then it's going to be hard to beat. So I think that's what places 3 Musketeers maybe in an awkward position in the meta. But yeah, otherwise, not a lot different here from the introduction of the starter deck cards. I think you'll see maybe a little bit more evolution, but not too much more. And then in terms of the underplayed or undertested, there was one deck that did very well. It did not make a top 4, unfortunately. It was close. It went 4-1. But Battle's Lilith Loop deck here, I saw it in action. It's pretty wild. It is what you would expect, but I will say Lilith Loop can go from 0 to 100 in a second. We don't even see, like, you know, I think the Glaive Memory Boost, maybe that is the right card over the other Memory Boost card for purple, but primarily what you're seeing here is with 4 Ginkakumon promotes, he was able to actually go into a Zwart over a Lilith with 4 memory and still keep turn with memory gain effects of Ginkakumon and some of the other inheritables, essentially, without having to use the Mega Digimon Fusion. So if you can manage that swing and, you know, maybe have some more Jack raids, it can get wild. That is why this deck is, I think, a potential sleeper. I personally, I still don't love Manoa. I think, like, if you really want an explosive turn with Lilithmon, which I think you need in some decks, you just need a turn where you're not just putting a bunch of bodies on the board, but you're putting a lot of pressure on one turn and really, like, you're biding your time. You're going to take one turn to take out more than half of their security or more. And then you basically say, hey, I've got, like, a bunch of bodies on the board that you can't deal with. There's no one card that can stop this. And that's also because, you know, Lady Devi is an 8 cost. Lady Devi being an 8 cost is, I think, the key that makes this deck hard to deal with, because there's a lot of, like, there's Gavalt Schwarmer, there's a bunch of cards out there that can, like, kind of deal with a bit of a board flood, but Lady Devi being 8k 8 cost, you know, if you can get that onto the board and you don't have too many things of the same DP, there's not really a lot that can deal with that. So if you can't win the following turn, you're kind of out of luck. I will say, interesting here, the only blockers in this deck are the Rebellimons. And that only gains blocker if you are digivolving. So, bit scary here. Not running any sort of Vilemons or any other kind of purple blockers. So yeah, that one's a bit tough. But yeah, the tie-in mat for the Manoa, that's the only thing that I personally, if you want to play Lilith Loop in this format, it's a flavor call. I do understand why people play it. Starting at 3 memory is important, but tie-in mat is just, if you're keeping turn and swinging with Zwart, if you're using Mega Digifusion, getting so much value off of Zwart, maybe you don't want to check too much security, which is fair, but to me, I don't know, the value is just too high. But yeah, and the only other deck that I would say that you should expect to maybe start seeing is a Gababond deck that starts incorporating red cards. I don't know how good it is in terms of the overall format. I think it's still a little too early, But what I mean by that is you're playing Gababond and you're playing maybe like the red ties that give you plus 1k. And you are also playing Lightning Joust that gives you sec plus 1 and plus 2k. The reason I think that would be a really interesting card and deck to see played and really get tested in earnest is in the mirror, in the Gababond mirror, it will give you a lot more pressure more quickly. In Craniumon matches, if those black Craniumon decks present a real problem for these Gababond decks, and if they're smart enough to play around having 3 bodies, so being Rattlestarred, right? If they can play around that, then you don't really have a lot of an answer as the Gababond player. You're kind of stuck there basically hoping they don't have ultimate flares before you can outrush them, right? Or Mechanoris. But with that, you're going to go with at least 1 Lightning Joust and nothing else. You'll go from 14 to 17,000 because you have to have a tie on board. So that's a 17,000 body swinging into security, sec plus 1. They can choose to block that with Crania or not. Odds are they probably won't. And then you're actually getting the bottom decking that you need of those Mechanorimons. So I think that personally, Red Gababond is, you know, this was the very first day of starter decks. So I understand why it probably wasn't out because it's just so untested in North America. But something to consider. With that said, though, hopefully this was really interesting for all of you in terms of seeing all this metagame data, seeing the deck list. Link to the entire tournament where you yourself can look at all the deck lists, look at the metagame is going to be in the description. Check it out. My next tournament is going to be on December 21st. More details coming on my Discord next week. Check that link out in the description. Thanks to all the players. It was awesome. Thanks to Wyatt from True Pain Gaming for co-commentating with me. If you want to watch some of those matches, it's on my Twitch. But yeah, I'll catch you all in a future video and let me know if this is something that you enjoyed. I went very long on this. I probably should be faster in the future. But anyways, Carpe Diem. Carpe Awesome, I should say.